Hello and welcome to the WRAP, WRAL's political podcast. I am your host this week, state government reporter Will Dorn, and I am here with my colleague, our education reporter, Emily Walkenhorst. Emily, nice to have you on the pod.
Glad to be here. This is my first WRAP. It's very exciting.
Well, there is a ton of education news happening at the local level, the state level, the federal level right now. It is a hot topic, so we're going to get into all of that, what's going on with cell phones in schools, what's going on with these plans to shut down the federal Department of Education, what kind of impact are we going to see there? But it hasn't just been education this week. We have seen the legislature focus not just on cell phones in schools, but on things like Hurricane Helene funding, investing the state pension plan into Bitcoin. And then we were recording this Friday, and today we heard from the state health plan that they are reversing the decision that was made just last year to cut GLP-1 weight loss drugs like Wegovy. They're trying to bring that back and bring that coverage back, but with some slightly different details. So we will dive into all of that. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about education. And Emily, you've been talking with some local education leaders about all of this talk around the federal Department of Education. Can you just tell us a little bit about, one, the amount of money that we get from the federal Department of Education here, and then two, if that department goes away, does the money go away? Does it come here through some other means? I think that's a huge question that a lot of people with kids in schools and people who are teachers and just everyone is really interested in.
Right. So what we're hearing is Trump has been drafting an executive order to begin the process of dismantling the Department of Education. Our understanding of that, for most people, including the new Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, is Congress would need to be who does that. And there's probably some politicking around filibusters and whatnot. But basically, Congress would have to do it. But Trump is very insistent on this. He wanted to do it in his first term. He didn't get it done, didn't have congressional support. He's pushing again. He has some support in Congress. But essentially, the details of, what a bill would be in Congress, which, some have been filed, every session for a while to do this. But we don't have a lot of information from the Trump administration about what he would like to see in a bill. So essentially, Congress has authorized all kinds of education programs. Programs for students with disabilities. Title I, which is for schools with higher concentrations of lower income students. There are all kinds of funding programs for rural schools, career and technical education. North Carolina gets about $1.5 billion every year from mostly those programs run through the U.S. Department of Education. Some of that is run through USDA, actually, because it's for school meals. That's who operates that program. But because Congress is who authorizes all this funding, Congress would have to make the choice to no longer authorize this funding. So,
Well, maybe. I mean, that's been a huge dispute with all of this, this DOGE program under Trump and these lawsuits where, they're trying to cut this funding that Congress has authorized. And there's, so many lawsuits over whether or not they can just go in and do that. So I don't know. I mean, could we see Elon Musk and crew just trying to unilaterally shut down the education department?
Well, once we see the executive order, we might have some clarity about what the Trump administration thinks they can do on their own. We know that they've already cut several grants, grant programs authorized through congressional funding, but where the U.S. Department of Education took applications and decided, yes, this school system should get this grant, this school system should get this college should get this grant. And, the U.S. Department of Education just canceled them at the recommendation of the Trump administration, basically because they're saying, oh, well, they might be including diversity, equity, and inclusion type programs in a way that we don't want. They've pointed to some examples, but, when I asked them, can you name specifically what was wrong with some of these programs in North Carolina that you cut all this funding for, they didn't really answer that. They just, said, overall, we're concerned about divisive concepts being taught as a part of some of these programs. Some of those programs did seek to increase teacher diversity. But anyway, so they did cut some of those things. So, what other programs does the Trump administration think they can maybe cut on their own without needing Congress? And people are, I think, very concerned about that. And what we hear from local leaders is basically they are worried. They don't know what to expect, though, because there's no EO out there yet.
Right. And you mentioned, that this the Department of Education is in charge of, for example, school meal money. So we don't know, for instance, if Department of Education goes away, will all of that money go away, or will it just be kind of the people in charge of handling that money, and maybe the states will just be in charge? But you mentioned, or you reported also here in Wake County, that rising meal costs are leading to some other concerns more locally, and I think that's just one of many reasons why Wake County Schools, which is the biggest public school system in the state, is going into a hiring freeze.
Yeah, so that was one concern they've had the last couple of years, rising meal costs specifically, where school meal programs, they kind of operate like restaurants. They raise their own funds, and so they've had to raise school meal prices the last couple of years, and it's still not enough. And actually, USDA is who is in charge of that specific program. And they're just not getting high enough reimbursement rates, is what we're hearing in the county, because the cost of supplies is going up so much. And the cost of reimbursing for free meals for low-income kids is just not necessarily covering those costs. But they're also worried about federal funding for next year. They've lost $5 million from one of these teacher grants that I mentioned before. And they're anticipating maybe we could lose more. We don't know what the Trump administration will ultimately do. So essentially, they're doing a 90-day hiring freeze. And the way that's going to work is you can hire for that position, but just not for, another 90 days if they're willing to wait. And so they're trying to basically just save more money next year. I asked them if they have a target dollar amount in mind. They don't really. They just want to fill that fund balance a little bit more in anticipation of the potential to lose federal dollars. They're opening 4 new schools next year. They're having higher enrollment, but then they don't know if they're going to maybe also lose some students and how many they might lose because of the expansion of the school voucher program called Opportunity Scholarships here. Even with an expansion this year, the school system still had an increase in enrollment. So they're also trying to predict a number that I think is just getting challenging.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch because, if the biggest school system in the state is doing a hiring freeze and, in a county that has not been afraid to, pass bonds, raising more money for schools, you wonder how it's, these exact same issues might affect, smaller, poorer, more rural parts of the state. And I think that's a big question that a lot of people have. And we've heard, even NC State is in a hiring freeze right now, in part because of some of the uncertainty from the federal government. We've seen companies like RTI, big employer here in the Triangle, laying off dozens, maybe hundreds of folks. The state legislature is pushing a bill right now to ban Attorney General Jeff Jackson from suing Donald Trump. And this comes after Jackson has sued Trump over a few of his executive orders, including the one that was attempting to slash NIH funding, which funds thousands of people's jobs at UNC Chapel Hill, Duke University, NC State, Wake Forest, a lot of the big universities here in the state. Duke and UNC alone receive over $1 billion last year from this program. So we're talking plenty of jobs. And we heard in the discussion at the legislature, some Democratic lawmakers are saying, why are you trying to stop the Attorney General of the state from being able to stick up for the state? He's been successful so far in stopping these NIH cuts. Now, as you've just been talking about, there have been other cuts that have gone through. But the NIH cuts in specific that Jeff Jackson, some other Democratic AGs have sued over, have been blocked in court. And what we heard from Republican lawmakers was, well, those cuts don't really concern me. That's the federal government cutting waste. And, some people in the Triangle might lose their jobs, but, not really any folks in my district. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch as this moves on. Does this really continue just hitting big urban areas with big school districts, big universities, or does this spread out to the more rural parts of the state? But that is something for a future episode of this. We are going to take a quick break right now. Stick around. We are going to talk about some more legislative action and that state health plan news I mentioned at the top of the podcast. Stick around. And we are back. Welcome to the wrap. While we were talking federal funding, I wanted to touch briefly on some of the big news of the week, which has been Hurricane Helene relief efforts and oversight efforts at the state legislature. We heard from some of Governor Josh Stein's top Helene people this week that they still don't have a solid answer in Western North Carolina for even some basic information like how many houses were damaged. And that was a problem for some lawmakers, but it really illustrates in a lot of ways the tough nature of doing recovery in the mountains. I mean, we've had obviously a lot of problems with hurricane recovery out east where it's very flat and you can see everything and it's not hard to build on flat ground. But in the mountains, I mean, you can't see all these houses from the road or even from the air. And so what we learned this week at the legislature was FEMA has one estimate for how many houses were probably damaged by the storm, but the local county governments that keep all the tax records, they say, whoa, FEMA is way off on this. And so there's this fight over how much money do we need to be rebuilding, what counties do we need to be looking at or not looking at quite as hard. And it just kind of illustrates the really tough nature of this relief effort and the rebuilding effort. It's going to take years.
Sounds like
it. We know that the grants that we're getting from HUD come with basically a 6-year time frame. So we could take until 2031 to fix some of these Helene damaged homes. And what we heard from both GOP lawmakers and the Stein administration was 6 years is too long. Nobody wants to be pushing up against that deadline. Everyone is going to try to make that happen as quickly as possible. But we don't know. We are still waiting on the feds to even send us the money to get started. In the meantime, while we wait on the federal government, because, I mean, that could be a year-long or more wait for us, the state legislature is pushing ahead with a request from Stein to fund some state money to at least get some construction started so that it's not, 2026 before people start seeing, rebuilds of their homes. That vote is probably coming up next week. We could also get a lot of other votes in the legislature, a bill to ban DEI trainings for public school teachers and DEI curriculum in schools, and also to ban cell phones in schools. And Emily, the cell phone thing I'm particularly interested in because the House and the Senate have kind of different visions of how this should play out, but both of them really kind of want to just let local school districts figure this out, right?
Right. So that is also something that a lot of education leaders are asking for. She's not superintendent anymore, but that's something that Catherine Truitt had really emphasized as well, I think, in conversations with lawmakers was, different schools are going to have different needs. One thing that we do hear a lot about is, well, obviously, an elementary school is very different from a high school. And so, different school systems might want to take different approaches, especially when you consider some districts might have the ability to do certain things that others might not. We've seen some pilot programs in like Chatham County, Hardin County to buy like pouches where basically you give a student a pouch and they buy them for the students. It's not something that's, so far on the school supply list. And the students put their phone in a pouch and there's like a thing where they lock it, but they can also easily unlock it, but it takes a few minutes. But then the student can keep their phone on them. So it's kind of a compromise. Your student's going to be without the phone.
Now, you and I have talked about this offline before, but we can bring that conversation to the podcast here. These pouches to me sound kind of like a waste of money. I mean, why not just let the students keep their phones in their pocket or their purse or whatever? And you know what? If the phone goes off or if they're using it inappropriately, then the teacher takes it. It's on the student. Like, why does the school district want to be spending this extra money on pouches?
So some districts are trying to crack down in that way without pouches. But one thing that we've heard, so I've just, talked casually kind of with teachers in Wake County over the years, and they've brought up cell phones. And, the problem for some of them, especially at the high school level, is students fight back. You try to take their phone, they fight back. It becomes a whole thing. You have 45 minutes to teach a class. Kids have to take a test at the end of the semester. You get graded on that test too. And suddenly you're spending 5 to 10 minutes of your precious class time trying to argue with a student about a phone. So a lot of teachers just get exhausted from enforcing it. Especially if you have 3 phones go off in class, that's 3 different times you have to talk to students. So in some ways, reforming the culture around this and, creating kind of backups, I think, is kind of the solution in some districts where they've been like, well, I don't know that it's in the budget to buy these pouches, but it still creates extra work for someone. So in some school districts, they're like, well, if you see a phone, you ought, as a teacher, you automatically press this button, make this phone call, do whatever, and the principal themselves will come to the room and they will confiscate the phone too. Well, okay, but then the principal has to do that out of their day. And then there are some people I've talked with who are like, I don't ever want to confiscate a phone because a parent's going to get mad at me for confiscating it. What if I drop it? What if the screen breaks? What if somebody tries to make me pay for it? And so it kind of just becomes this whole thing where, actually surveys show most schools do already ban phones, and they have for years. So why are we talking about phones being a problem in class? Well, it's because they're not enforcing the bans, and that's the problem.
Yeah, so is it the case that the teachers want the legislature to push ahead on this because it'll put some more pressure on the administration, the principals, to actually back them up when they do take kids' phones? Is that kind of the driving force behind this? Because I know there's a lot of parents who are not so happy with this idea.
Yeah, a lot of parents really aren't because they're worried about being able to contact their kid at any given time, whether it's an emergency or just, hey, tell me if your basketball practice is a different schedule and I need to pick you up at a different time. I think teachers really do want to do something about cell phones. They might have differing senses of the approach on that, but to some extent, having, a uniform policy that is just thoroughly embedded in a school's culture, I think would be a big benefit to a lot of these teachers who are tired of dealing with phones. I mean, imagine you're trying to teach kids a really important thing that, is literally your job, and they're watching a YouTube video and not listening to you. That's really discouraging for a lot of teachers, and especially early career teachers. I talked to a teacher a couple of years ago who, he had quit. I was just doing a standard story about teacher turnover, and one of the biggest things he kept talking to me about was, I feel like kids don't listen to me because they are just watching YouTube videos, and I get really tired of fighting them. And he just feels, he just felt like he wasn't making a difference. And that's why people become teachers. They want to make a difference.
Well, kids, you can find WRAL on YouTube too, but don't watch it during school, please. Mm-hmm. I want to wrap up this week by talking about State Treasurer Brad Briner. He has only been in office about 2 months now, replacing Dale Folwell, but he is making some big moves. He has announced that they want to reverse the decision made last year to cut GLP-1 coverage. This is those drugs like Wegovy, those weight loss drugs that the state health plan used to cover, made the decision not to because they are so expensive. But actually just a few days ago, several of the manufacturers of these drugs announced big cuts to their prices. And now the state health plan says, okay, well, with that, plus combined with we think we can get the legislature to maybe sign off on some extra money for this, we can bring back coverage, not for everybody, but basically for about 14 or 15,000 of the most obese state employees who need this help, who aren't already on these drugs because of diabetes or whatever, because we still have covered them for diabetes, but not just for weight loss. I talked to him on Friday. Treasurer Briner said that, previously the rules had been they had to treat everybody the same. So, if if I was like, hey, I think I want to lose 5 pounds and, on Ozempic or whatever, they had to pay that $1,000 a month for me. And that's not just a sustainable way to do that at all. So the new rules that they're looking at to bring this back, if they get the money they want from the legislature, would not allow, people who are only trying to lose a little bit of weight. It would really be focused on, someone who needs to lose 100 pounds, something like that. But for people who really need these drugs, they are talking about bringing them back. So that's going to be a big change that's going to be debated probably as part of the state budget later this spring and this summer. And then there's a totally separate bill that Briner is also pushing for to let the Treasurer's Office invest the state pension plan in cryptocurrency. Emily, I don't know about you. I am not in cryptocurrency. I probably should have bought some during COVID. It's gone up about 400% in the last couple of years.
Something like that.
Yeah, but of course it is very easy to Monday morning quarterback an investment, and there's a lot of people who are concerned by the volatility in crypto markets because while we have seen it booming in recent years, just in the last few weeks, it's really started to dive. And there's been plenty of times, throughout the brief history of Bitcoin and other cryptos that we've seen, big drops in the market or just, entire coin markets just go away. And so this bill wouldn't, it would have some safeguards on the treasurer. He could only invest, up to 10%, but that's still billions of dollars. I mean, the state pension plan is close to $100 billion. It's actually one of the biggest investment plans anywhere. It's massive.
It's massive, yes.
And there's a lot of, retired or close to retirement teachers, other state workers who say, hold on a second, like this crypto stuff seems kind of like a snake oil situation. I don't know if I want to do that. But then you have a lot of other people who say, are you kidding me? Look at these returns. The stock market, you're lucky if you get, 7 or 8% in a year. And this is doubling, tripling in a year. So there's a lot of movement to push for this, to put some state money into, it wouldn't be into specifically Bitcoin, it would be into an ETF, which if you are really interested in the details, I break those down in my most recent article about that. But it's big changes coming from Treasurer Briner at the Treasurer's Office with the state health plan, the state pension plan, definitely things that we're going to continue watching as those move along. And lots in the education world as well. So thank you, Emily, for joining us on the podcast this week. We need to have you back when there's some more action on these cell phone bills, DEI bills, Department of Education cuts, because that is not going away. We're going to keep hearing news stories about all of that.
I'm sure we will.
All right. Well, that has been this week's episode of The Wrap. Catch us next time. Thanks.